Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Toast and Topics. We're heading into another autumn, and this one has some special significance because there will be a presidential election on Tuesday, November 5th, pitting Vice President Kamala Harris against former President Donald Trump. There have been many policy debates happening in this atmosphere, but few have been more interesting to Sachin and me than the conversations surrounding international trade.
That's right, Ben. And you're one of the biggest trade buffs that I know. And, living in a big city like New York myself, I'm always amazed when I see the amount of global commerce that revolves around this city. And it's true that trade is massively important for any political candidate to get right, especially in a world that's become increasingly interconnected and globalized.
Yeah, for sure. And so, with all that said, Sachin and I are going to take this episode to think about trade through the lens of the U.S. political climate. We'll outline the kinds of trade policies that both presidential candidates are proposing, and then we will sketch out some of the economic and political effects of each of their respective positions. So, Sachin, do you want to start us off here with a brief introduction to some of the basics of these trade policies?
Yeah, sure. So, for those in our audience who might not be as familiar with trade concepts in economics, we thought it would be first helpful to give a very basic overview of some of the main p policies as it relates to trade that are being proposed today. And those are tariffs and subsidies. Tariffs are plain and simply a fancy word for taxes or duties imposed by a government on imported goods and services. When a government imposes a tariff, it sets a certain tax rate, which is usually a percentage on specific imported goods. For example, a 10% tariff on imported steel means that for every $100 worth of steel imported, the importer must pay an additional $10 to the government. And this unsurprisingly makes it more expensive to purchase imported products. And the whole idea is that this additional cost will make imports less attractive to domestic consumers compared to comparable domestically produced goods. Tariffs are a very common policy tool to protect domestic industries, generate revenue for governments, and it's also used quite commonly as a bargaining tool in trade policy with other countries. And historically, they were even more important to the US specifically because customs entering the country were easy to track and therefore to tax. And just for context here, in the 1790s in the United States, revenues from tariffs made up 95% of US government revenue. And we obviously don't live in such a world anymore, but tariffs are still undeniably important. Subsidies, on the other hand, are another important concept to understand. And although many might not traditionally think of subsidies as being a trade policy explicitly, they actually are. And in essence, a subsidy involves the government offering some kind of financial reward to a producer for producing a given good. And this can have the effect of driving down the price of that good and increasing its production because the producers don't need to charge the full cost of the good to the consumer. In other words, the subsidy can make up the difference between whatever price for the good that's being charged and the good's cost. So ultimately, that matters for global trade because if producers in one country receive a subsidy, the prices they offer for their goods can undercut prices in the global market, and that could make producers in other countries less competitive.
I think that's a good point to pivot toward how these policies are informing current policy debates. We're living in a unique time in that while American policy over the past 70 years has generally been in favor of free trade, meaning trade unencumbered by large scale interventions such as subsidies or tariffs. Public opinion seems now to have soured on that openness to some extent. According to a recent survey from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for example, 66% of Americans think that the government should place restrictions on imported foreign goods to protect jobs here in the United States, and that's up from 60% in 2018. And there are a lot of reasons for that sentiment. For example, many are concerned about the quote unquote China shock, referring to how China's opening to global trade and its accession to the World Trade Organization may have hollowed out many U.S. manufacturing communities. For others, there is a concern that certain strategic industries, for example, say renewable energy, will not be able to remain in the United States without some level of protection via tariffs or subsidies in the face of foreign competition. So, with all that said, let's get into some of the views of the 2024 presidential candidates on trade and just try to understand at a high level what they are proposing.
Yeah, good idea. So I'll take the policy proposals of former President Donald Trump, whose trade policy centers around protectionism and prioritizing U.S. trade balances. And some of his proposals include imposing a tariff of 10% or more across the board, and even higher tariffs on countries like China specifically. And that reflects the belief that foreign countries have exploited the US through unfair trade practices historically. And that has led to job losses and a decline in domestic manufacturing in particular. In the prior election, when Trump was running for the first time, he famously said, quote, "I am a tariff man," and suggested that countries should essentially pay for the privilege of doing trade with us. And in this election cycle, it's really no different. Trump has proposed similar tariffs across the board, which would more than triple the average American tariff. Um, in general, the trade policy proposed by Trump has been marked by a very protectionist trade stance. And, you know, in his previous administration, he imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods to pressure China into changing its trade practices, which he argues were unfair and damaging to the US and its interests. And he also renegotiated trade deals like the USMCA, which stands for the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, to replace NAFTA, with a focus on better terms of trade for American workers. Um, Trump continues to advocate for using tariffs as a tool to protect American industries and to reduce trade deficits and help enforce what he thinks are fair trade practices. So that sums it up in a nutshell.
Harris has been somewhat quieter with regards to her proposed trade policies, but based on her record in the Senate and based on the policies that have already been pursued by the Biden administration, I think we can obtain a reasonably strong sense of the types of trade policies that she would pursue as president. For one thing, I think it's worth noting that she has sought to differentiate herself from former President Trump by describing his proposed tariffs as excessive. At the Democratic National Convention, for example, she noted that they would amount to being a, quote, national sales tax that could significantly raise prices. But the Biden administration, while not as assertive on tariffs as the Trump administration, has still pursued some somewhat protectionist policies. For instance, President Biden largely left intact the tariffs that Trump had imposed on China during the 2018 trade war. And further, the subsidies of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA for short, that President Biden signed into law have some protectionist overtones. They, for example, award substantial money for electric vehicle and renewable energy products, but the key criterion for being awarded this money is that these goods must be manufactured in the United States. So, in essence, this IRA policy is a subsidy for American-made goods that could place at a competitive disadvantage foreign producers in these same industries. And Vice President Harris has touted her role in the IRA and has said that she would continue to use, quote, targeted tariffs.
So let's move on to talking about the impact of some of these policies at a high level. I think that every tax in general has pros and cons, and tariffs in particular are no different. Research suggests that despite the possible benefits of tariffs, there are also some very serious risks to pursuing them on a large scale. The first is trade wars, and the biggest risk of tariffs are that other countries will retaliate. The primary aim of tariffs is to reduce a country's trade deficit, and A trade deficit is simply defined as exports less imports. The trade deficit would be expected to shrink if foreign imports decrease. However, the argument here misses the fact that retaliatory tariffs are likely to follow, which would ultimately reduce our exports. The spread of universal tariffs would be very similar to a giant tax on cross-border transactions, and that would in general make international commerce less attractive. In the case of the first round of tariff increases in 2021 between the US and China, China actually tripled its tariffs on the US in response. A study from Indiana University actually estimates that a global tariff war would shrink American GDP by about 1%, with an even more outsized impact on smaller, more trade-reliant economies. In fact, even the Director General of the World Trade Organization said this year that a 10% American import tariff could lead to a, quote, free-for-all, which would upend the stability and predictability of trade. So these retaliatory measures from foreign countries can kick off a longer term trade war whereby both countries simply continue raising tariffs on the other. And this would ultimately lead to higher prices globally. And that would be a pretty bad thing when you think about it. The second important impact here are higher domestic prices. Tariffs are undeniably an inflationary policy, and they're also regressive since they hurt those on lower incomes by taxing more of their spending and by raising the price of goods. Studies have found that almost all the cost of tariffs have been borne by American consumers rather than by foreign producers. And the U.S. International Trade Commission found a near one-to-one increase in the price of American imports in the wake of tariffs on China. And if the bulk of the tariff bill is passed on to American consumers, a 10% tariff would be estimated to cost American households about $2,000 per year, which is not insignificant. They also impact industrial sectors such as construction and manufacturing, which ironically they look to protect via higher material costs. The Peterson Institute estimated that American steel users, in effect, paid an extra $650,000 per job created in the steel industry in higher input costs. So while the companies directly protected from these industries may not be as impacted, others downstream will certainly face higher input prices and potentially lower profitability as a result.
Interesting. It's also, I think, important to unpack the impact of subsidies, and so I'll take care of that right now. The first impact that it's important to consider is on prices, and there are really two ways of looking at this. One is that the effect of subsidies will just be to make the goods being subsidized cheaper. For example, according to reporting from S&P, the investment subsidies for wind and solar power, combined with the production subsidies for green hydrogen production through the Inflation Reduction Act, could subsidize green hydrogen production at up to $4.50 per kilogram, which is in fact higher than the estimated cost of production in parts of the United States. And so, in other words, the price could be effectively zero. So that's one way of looking at the price of subsidies. The other is the actual price of paying for the subsidies, which can be somewhat expensive. The CHIPS Act, for example, which provided funds for the U.S. semiconductor industry, allocates $53 billion in subsidies to support chip manufacturing. That's a lot of money. And the Inflation Reduction Act itself contains $400 billion in new spending and tax breaks to essentially subsidize clean energy initiatives. So overall subsidies, while appealing in the sense that they can reduce prices for some goods, do, come at the expense of the taxpayer. And next, there's also a risk of retaliation associated with subsidies. Just like tariffs, subsidies can provoke retaliation by the countries that are placed at a competitive disadvantage by them. For example, the IRA was apparently a thunderclap because of the protectionist nature of the provisions that allocated funds specifically for goods being produced in the United States. The European Union, for example, has at this point proposed a whole suite of new funding programs designed to subsidize its own industries, essentially as a way to directly counter the effects of the IRA. And in the end, that kind of retaliation by foreign countries could actually nullify some of the objectives of policies like the IRA, which, of course, would be unfortunate as so much money is being spent on these policies. Um, there is a general effect on competitiveness from subsidies that I do think can be appealing. Namely, subsidies have some advantages for industrial policy. They can help to encourage investment and production of certain key industries in the United States. For instance, the US is currently leading the world in funding in its semiconductor industry. That includes private funding, and that's in no small part due to the incentives provided in the CHIPS Act. The US is also significantly increasing its clean energy investments. Investment in the first quarter of 2024, for example, was 40% higher than the level the year before. And that's also being driven by the really heavy incentives that the US government has provided for investment and production in this clean energy domain. And so subsidies really can be a very compelling way for a country to prioritize a set of industries and then encourage production and the development of industrial capacity to enhance that production.
Those are all really good points, Ben, and I think you summed it up well. We've talked about a lot here, so I think we should conclude this episode by trying to just summarize everything thus far. So, trade policy, as we've talked about, is highly important because it quite literally impacts us all. And the trade policies that we set define how we interact with other countries on a global scale, and it shapes everything from domestic employment to the distribution of industries, and perhaps most importantly, the price of goods. We've talked in this episode about tariffs and subsidies as some of the core economic concepts being outlined in this election season. And both of these policies, I think, try to achieve some pretty similar objectives, but in very different ways. That is, protecting and encouraging certain strategic domestic industries to succeed, and altering the relative price of certain goods on a global scale. And I think that in both cases, these policies come with fairly sizable risks, most notably the fact that countries will often retaliate against them by doing the same thing in return. And, in a world that's become far more interconnected, but also more inward looking as it relates to trade than it was maybe a decade ago, I think it makes it all the more important to get trade policy right and find a balance between the right policies at a top level.
Yeah, that's right, Sachin. And interestingly, while the candidates that we have in this fall's presidential election vary with respect to the intensity with which they would pursue these policies, it does seem that we are living in an era that is substantially more skeptical of free trade in the past, and that we may be seeing more tariffs and subsidies in the years ahead.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. And next episode, we will continue on the policy theme and try to unpack fiscal deficits and its sustainability, particularly as it relates to the US. So we will see you then. Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and are purely intended for educational purposes. They are not an endorsement of a political candidate, nor are they representative of any institutions that we're associated with.